All right, world. I think we're back for another edition of Facebook Live. I'm Sam Lichtenstein, welcoming my great colleague here, Emily Hawthorne. We're here to talk about something, Emily, that I know is near and dear to our hearts and is not a country that gets the attention it deserves, which is Tunisia. So for those of us who may not, amid, U.S.-China tensions, Russia-Ukraine war, the whole host of other issues that make the news not be watching, what exactly has been going on recently, and why should we be caring about this in the first place?
Yeah, Sam, you bring up sort of the very often the first way that people introduce Tunisia when they talk about geopolitics at large. It's sort of like little Tunisia, this tiny North African country. Why does it matter? I remember in one of my first analyst briefing meetings, I was talking about Tunisia, and the big question was, why does this even matter? But Tunisia matters for a number of reasons. It's a key member of the Mediterranean community. It is a sort of stopgap, a key place along Mediterranean migration routes. It is politically a really important place in the broader Arab world, known for being the starting point of the Arab Spring protests in 2010, December 2010, and then through 2011. And really one of the places where the most dramatic political changes took place since the Arab Spring. Now, the reason, getting to your question of sort of what's happening now, there's several things happening, but there's economically, there's a really severe financial crisis happening, and we could get more into it, but the long story short is that Tunisia just doesn't have the kind of fiscal margins and buffers that a number of other countries in the region have to sort of fall back on. So the financial crisis is getting worse, and Tunisians are feeling it quite severely, and that has a lot of impacts. And then politically, as I sort of briefly mentioned, there have been a lot of political changes in Tunisia since the Arab Spring, but the current phase of politics right now is driving a lot of political risk because there's a lot of uncertainty about where it's going. We've had a reversion back to a very centralized executive presidential system that creates a handful of risks, whether you're a Tunisian or whether you're a sort of foreign company operating in Tunisia, of which we have many clients interested in Tunisia. And then there's security issues. There are protests happening for a variety of issues. A big driver is related to migration. We could talk more about that if we want to. And then also there are protests related to the economic situation. So there's a whole host of things happening, and then a couple of reasons why Tunisia does sort of matter.
All right. So, I mean, we could obviously talk about this for a long time, Emily. Thankfully, we're not going to bore perhaps some of our listeners with all of our deep intellectual conversations about Tunisia. But you listed so many practical things there. And what I find very interesting about the country right now is you have both what I would call like strategic concerns, but also very tactical on the ground challenges. So if you're an organization that is either operating there, nearby, even across the Mediterranean, in places in Southern Europe and elsewhere, like what's going on actually has real practical implications for you.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you laid out like multiple things. There's kind of this creeping authoritarianism. One might not even call it creeping. One might just call it authoritarianism by this point under Kais. You have a huge economic challenge that only seems to be continuing to get worse. You have this massive influx of sub-Saharan African migrants that are moving north basically to try in desperation to reach Europe. And you have all of these kind of macro strategic risks having a real like on the ground impact in terms of, food shortages, in terms of protests, in terms of we've actually seen lethal violence in the past week during a protest. So I guess, how do you, someone that is looking at this every day, make sense of this and tell people, okay, out of all of this noise, here's what we should really be paying attention to?
Yeah, excellent question. And I think, when we're thinking about just those tactical considerations, whether you're an energy company who we've talked to with regards to Tunisia, agricultural company we've talked to with regards to Tunisia, tourism companies are very, very interested in Tunisia right now. They are concerned about really tactical issues like protests having serious impact on traffic flows, on businesses being closed, on real physical security considerations for factories and office buildings and highways. Tunisia is one of the countries right now where there is a very, very high risk of protests, typically not very violent, but more likely to happen over the course of the summer because of some of these drivers we talked about. Specifically, the economic strain is just so severe right now. The cost of living crisis in Tunisia has resulted in very severe food shortages, and sort of soaring food prices for things, staples like bread, tuna, coffee, sugar. And we've had a lot of issues where we've had a lot of just anecdotal reporting over the last few months, and even just accelerating in the last few weeks, of people fighting over shipments of things like wheat and flour, bakeries baking smaller and smaller baguettes because they don't have enough durum wheat and flour to produce food for people. So I think there's just a broad concern for businesses that already have operations in Tunisia. There are concerns that their employees, that any foreign visitors, or foreign employees visiting sort of installations or operations in country, that they could witness really significant disruptions or just even protests that create nuisances. It's kind of a cliche sometimes when you're talking about the Middle East and North Africa to be like, oh, there are protests and there's security issues, and that's sort of overblown, I think, for a lot of the Middle East and North Africa. But Tunisia's situation right now economically is so severe that people are really suffering, and it is creating a high risk of protest. And so we often downplay protest risk, I think appropriately for our clients, because we can help put it in context. But I think right now in Tunisia, it actually is really concerning, and there is a high likelihood of those sort of tactical security disruptions taking place. So that's just off the top of my head. That's one way I would answer that question.
Well, it certainly makes sense. And one thing I would add, that I've learned from you is just the power that a lot of the unions in Tunisia have. And unlike in some other parts of the region where civil society is highly constrained, you actually do have very influential union activities. So even if you don't see violence during protests, you're able, if the union really puts effort into it, to call out a lot of people. And of course, that can have a lot of varying disruptive impacts.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And yeah, Tunisia is notable because it does have one of the largest labor unions in the world when you think about like the percentage of the population that's a part of it. And they do call people out to the street when it matters. And it usually doesn't turn into violence, but it does disrupt commercial activity. Remarkably, this isn't yet having a really profound impact on the president, as you mentioned, President Said, on his popularity. But we do think that that's something that will happen over time if the economic situation just continues to get worse. And if Kais Said, the president, does not agree to some of the economic reforms that the IMF is asking for in exchange for the loan that they have a staff level agreement for, if something has to give, something has to drop, and somebody's going to have to compromise within that IMF deal, because the economic situation is getting to the point where Tunisia needs an influx of external cash in order to afford very, very basic imports like flour, and sugar and wheat. So that's just another consideration that's top on our mind, and certainly something that clients are asking about.
All right, so we've covered a little bit of kind of the strike and protest activity. We've covered a little politics, a little economics. The one thing we haven't really delved into that really unites all three of those areas is the immigration situation.
Yeah.
And this, personally speaking, I think is kind of the most fascinating dynamic that's going on. I mean, to put it very bluntly, you just have this massive influx of individuals from sub-Saharan Africa in desperation trying to reach Europe. Obviously, they're going north, and just logically speaking, a good jumping off point is Tunisia. And you see these, unfortunately, tragically, repeated scenes of boats taking off, of course, not only from Tunisia, from other neighboring countries, but, drownings at sea, just horrific scenes. But Tunisia has this kind of interesting dynamic that we haven't seen in some of the other North African states, where the authorities have basically been using a lot of, either one could say xenophobic, if not overtly racist rhetoric, basically saying that this is an influx of Black sub-Saharan Africans that are not part of the people we identify with. They're causing problems and have now been routinely accused by human rights organizations of multiple violations. And the people in Tunisia are also now whether it's true or not, starting to perceive a lot of these individuals as causing crime and bringing other challenges, even potentially extremism in some cases, or at least those are the claims that are being made. So you have this really tense situation where you have all of these desperate people coming northward. You have authorities and now the population turning against them. What is the environment like on the ground, and how do we interpret the risk around this?
Yeah, I agree that this is one of the more sort of salient issues right now. And I do think it is overtly racist rhetoric that's coming from, the Tunisian president and others in power that is sort of empowering Tunisian security forces to crack down more on migrants. It's coming up against, again, the economic strain that Tunisians are feeling and the fear that some of these migrants are working in jobs that should be reserved for Tunisians. This very familiar sort of anti-immigrant sentiment that you see all over the world, but it's become much more prominent in Tunisia in recent months and years because of the economic situation and the high level of unemployment. I think for anybody that's concerned about stability in Tunisia, I think it's safe to say that this issue is going to get worse. And one thing that we were talking about recently is this dynamic of the security forces being empowered to crack down on any sort of if there's a protest that's started by migrants who are demanding better treatment or are protesting getting evicted from their homes, because that's something that's been happening across Tunisia. It is likely that turns into some pretty significant violence, quite tragically. It is less likely that the government is going to crack down on protests that are starting because of grassroots economic issues by Tunisian nationals themselves, because they're concerned about, what that would, the optics of that, the message that sends, et cetera.
There's a lot
So
worse there.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think that and the fact that Tunisia right now is trying to negotiate with European countries for some aid and some loans. And there is a sort of plethora of different positions across European leadership about what to do about the sort of migration crisis, and people attempting again and again to cross the Mediterranean in search of economic opportunities. Tunisia is going to be willing to tighten its borders and to crack down on migrants to try and prevent people from leaving Tunisia, try and prevent people from even entering Tunisia, if it means that there is some money from the EU in exchange for that. And that's something that I think we are watching for over the coming months to see if that happens. But I do think that the stability situation, or that there will be some instability related to this migration issue over the course of the summer and into the fall.
All right, well, plenty to chew on there. And I know in our third quarter forecast that came out, I guess, just under 2 weeks ago now, on both our geopolitical and threat intelligence forecasts, Tunisia features prominently. So for those of you that are interested to learn more, have operations on the ground, as you can see at the banner there at ranenetwork.com, RANE network.com, definitely can check out more Tunisia coverage, plenty more from our recent forecasts. And otherwise, Emily, hope it's a great weekend for you.
Thanks. You too, Sam.